In a university archive, there exists a photograph most people will never see. It was taken in 1932, somewhere in rural Kentucky. The woman in it is 23 years old. Written on the back in pencil was her name, but the pencil has faded. What hasn't faded is her face, narrow and hollow-eyed, staring directly into the camera with an expression that can only be described as knowing. In that photograph, she's 7 months pregnant. According to the medical records that accompanied it, she had been missing for 11 months before she reappeared at her family's cabin, her belly swollen, refusing to speak about where she'd been or who the father was. The child she gave birth to lived for 6 days. When it finally surfaced decades later, the autopsy report revealed genetic abnormalities so severe that 3 separate doctors refused to sign their names to the findings. This is not legend. This is not folklore. This is documented history that was intentionally buried. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Her name was Ethel Morrow, and her story represents one of the most disturbing cases of systematic familial isolation, inbreeding, and community silence ever documented in American history. What happened to Ethel during the year she vanished has never been fully explained. But from medical records, census data, genetic studies conducted in secret, and testimony given under oath decades later, what we do know paints a picture so deeply unsettling that it forces us to confront a question most Americans never want to ask. In how many forgotten hollows and backwoods communities did families live like this? How many Ethels were there? And more importantly, how many stories like hers are still hidden, filed away in archives marked restricted, waiting for someone to finally tell the truth? Tonight, that truth is what we're going to tell. And I warn you now. Once you hear it, you won't forget it. By the time Ethel was born, the Morrow family had lived in the same stretch of eastern Kentucky wilderness for over 100 years. In any traditional sense, they weren't farmers. They didn't participate in the local economy. They rarely came into town. And when they did, people noticed. Store owners would later recall that the Morrows always came in groups, never alone, and that they spoke in a dialect so thick and archaic, it sounded like English from another century, which in a sense it was. Studying the region in the 1970s, linguistic researchers determined that some isolated Appalachian families had preserved speech patterns from the 1700s, passed down through generations that had almost no contact with the outside world. The Morrows were one of those families. But language wasn't the only thing they'd preserved. A troubling picture is painted by census records from 1900, 1910, and 1920. The same surnames appear over and over within the family tree, not as distant cousins marrying, but as siblings and parents, children and uncles, nieces and parents. In the 1920 census, there are 14 people living in the Morrow household. Of those 14, 11 share the last name Morrow by birth, not marriage. A note was made in the margin of his ledger by the census taker, a man named Fletcher Green. It's barely legible, but researchers have since confirmed what it says. Family structure unclear. Possible errors in reporting. Recommend follow-up. That follow-up never happened. 6 months later, Fletcher Green died in what was officially ruled a hunting accident. The coroner's report noted that the wound trajectory was inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot, but no investigation was opened. The Morrows attended his funeral. They stood in the back, and according to one witness, they smiled. By the time Ethel was born in 1909, the genetic damage was already visible. A public health nurse who visited the hollow in 1925 as part of a rural tuberculosis screening program wrote in her private journal, later donated to a state historical society, that several of the Morrow children displayed what's called the mark of the blood. Webbed fingers, eyes set too far apart, pronounced jaw deformities. One child, she wrote, could not speak, though he appeared to understand commands. Another had teeth that grew in double rows. She reported her findings to the county health office. They told her the Morrows were a known family and that it was best not to interfere. She never went back. And within that isolated, genetically collapsing family unit, Ethel Morrow grew up knowing nothing else. Ethel Morrow was last seen on April 14, 1931, until the day she disappeared. She was 22 years old. According to a statement given by her brother, or perhaps her uncle, the records are deliberately vague. She had walked down to the creek that ran behind the family's property to fetch water. She never came back. The family didn't report her missing. Not to the sheriff, not to neighbors, not to anyone. For weeks, nobody outside the hollow even knew she was gone. It wasn't until a traveling preacher stopped by the Morrow cabin in late May, asking if the family wanted to attend a revival meeting, that word finally slipped out. The preacher later told authorities that when he asked about Ethel, her father, a man in his 50s with milky eyes and hands that trembled, said only, "She's been called away." When pressed, he refused to elaborate. The preacher left and reported the conversation to the county sheriff, a man named Tom Calloway, who had been in office for nearly 20 years and knew better than most what went on in the remote parts of his jurisdiction. Sheriff Calloway did go to the Morrow property. He went with one deputy. At the edge of the clearing, they were met by 3 men holding rifles, not aiming them, just holding them. Calloway asked to speak with the family about Ethel. He was told she had gone to stay with relatives in Virginia. When he asked which relatives, he was told that was family business. By his own later admission, Calloway didn't push it. He wrote in his incident report that the family seemed uncooperative but not threatening, and that there was no evidence of foul play. He closed the case. Ethel Morrow was officially considered a runaway. For 11 months, she existed nowhere. No records, no sightings, no letters. It was as if she had been erased. And then in March of 1932, she came back. A local doctor named Raymond Haskell was called to the Morrow home in the middle of the night. He'd never treated the family before. They didn't use doctors, but someone had ridden into town and banged on his door, saying a woman was in labor and losing blood. Haskell later testified that he initially refused, knowing the family's reputation, but the man pleaded with him, saying the woman would die without help. So he went. What he found in that cabin, he would describe years later as the most disturbing scene of his 40-year medical career. Ethel was there on a bare mattress on the floor in active labor. She was emaciated. Her hair had been cut short almost to the scalp. Her arms were covered in scars, some old, some new. And when Haskell tried to speak to her, tried to ask her name, where she had been, who the father was, she turned her head away and stared at the wall. She didn't make a sound. Not during labor, not when the child was born, not even when Haskell told her the baby was alive. She just stared. And in the corner of the room, sitting in silence, were 4 men watching. The child was a boy. He weighed 4 pounds 11 ounces. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Dr. Haskell noted in his private records that the infant had several immediately visible abnormalities: a cleft palate, fused fingers on both hands, and eyes that didn't track movement properly. But what disturbed him most wasn't what he could see. It was what he could feel. When he examined the baby's skull, he found the bones soft, unfused in places they should have been solid. The fontanelles, the soft spots on an infant's head, were far larger than normal, and there were additional gaps along the suture lines that shouldn't have existed at all. He knew immediately that this child wouldn't survive long. He told the family the baby needed to be taken to a hospital. They refused. He offered to stay the night and monitor the infant. They told him his services were no longer needed. One of the men handed him $5 in crumpled bills and walked him to the door. Haskell left. He said later that he felt ashamed for leaving, but he also felt afraid and fear, he admitted. 6 days later, the baby died. Dr. Haskell was not called back. The family buried the child themselves somewhere on their property. No death certificate was filed. No funeral was held. It would have remained completely undocumented if not for a visiting state health inspector named Margaret Lowe, who happened to be in the county conducting a survey of infant mortality rates in rural areas. She heard about the Morrow baby through a nurse in town and insisted on investigating. She went to the hollow. She demanded to see the burial site and, remarkably, they let her. What she found was a shallow grave marked with a crude wooden cross. She insisted the body be exhumed for examination. The family, likely fearing legal consequences, complied. The infant's remains were taken to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfurt. And that's when the real horror came to light. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Ernest Whitmore, a pathologist with over 30 years of experience. His report, which wasn't made public until 1978 after a Freedom of Information request by a genealogist researching Appalachian families, is clinical in language but devastating in its findings. The child had died of respiratory failure caused by severe pulmonary hyperplasia, underdeveloped lungs, but that was just the immediate cause. The underlying issues were far worse. Whitmore identified skeletal malformations consistent with what we now recognize as the result of multigenerational inbreeding. The child's ribs were malformed. His spine showed signs of incomplete vertebral fusion. And then there was the brain. Whitmore noted that the cerebral cortex was underdeveloped with visible structural abnormalities that would have caused profound cognitive impairment had the child lived. He concluded his report with a single devastating line: the genetic load carried by this infant suggests parental consanguinity of the highest degree. In plain English, the parents were closely related, very closely related, and this wasn't the first generation it had happened. The question that haunted investigators for decades was simple. Where had Ethel been for those 11 months? In his personal diary, archived after his death in 1964, Dr. Haskell noted that Ethel's physical condition when he saw her suggested prolonged malnourishment and confinement. The scars on her arms were not self-inflicted. They were restraint marks. Deep, old wounds consistent with rope or leather bindings. Her muscle tone was severely diminished, indicating she had spent months with limited mobility. And there was something else he noticed but didn't put in his official report. Her feet were calloused in strange patterns, as if she had walked barefoot over rough terrain repeatedly, but only in a limited area. Like pacing. Like circling. Like someone kept in a small space with a dirt floor, walking the same path over and over for months. The health inspector, Margaret Lowe, became obsessed with the case. She returned to the area multiple times over the next 2 years, quietly interviewing neighbors, speaking with anyone who had any contact with the Morrow family. What she pieced together was never officially documented, but her personal correspondence, preserved in a university collection, tells the story. According to one neighbor who spoke on condition of anonymity, there was a root cellar on the Morrow property. Old stone construction built back into a hillside with a heavy wooden door that was always kept locked. The neighbor claimed that in the fall of 1931, months after Ethel disappeared, he heard sounds coming from that direction when he was hunting nearby. Not animal sounds. Human sounds. Crying. He didn't investigate. He said he knew better. Another source, a woman who had been a school teacher in the area, told Lowe that one of the younger Morrow children had once mentioned Ethel in the ground during a rare visit to the schoolhouse. When the teacher asked what that meant, the child went silent and never spoke of it again. The theory that emerged, whispered but never proven, was that Ethel had been kept in that root cellar, hidden and contained, and that during those 11 months, she had been systematically abused by members of her own family in what can only be described as a deliberate attempt to produce offspring. This wasn't accidental inbreeding born of isolation. This was intentional. Planned. Evidence suggests that certain isolated families in Appalachia held beliefs rooted in profound ignorance and twisted interpretations of biblical lineage, that keeping bloodlines pure was a form of spiritual preservation, that marrying outside the family diluted something sacred. Ethel wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a victim of ideology, a breeding experiment conducted by her own blood. And when she finally emerged, pregnant and broken, she had been so thoroughly traumatized that she never spoke a coherent sentence about it again for the rest of her life. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In 1968, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky named Dr. Philip Crane began a research project that would consume the next 8 years of his life. He was studying the effects of prolonged genetic isolation on small population groups, and someone had mentioned the Morrow family to him. By then, most of the original generation had died. Ethel herself had passed away in 1954 at the age of 45 from what was listed as heart failure, but there were descendants still living in the area. Crane obtained permission from the state to conduct a genetic survey, framing it as a public health initiative. What he discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. He collected blood samples, family histories, medical records going back decades. And when he began mapping the family tree, he realized he wasn't looking at a tree at all. He was looking at a closed loop, a genetic spiral that had been tightening for over a century. Crane's research identified at least 4 generations of systematic inbreeding within the Morrow line. Parent-child pairings, brother-sister unions, uncle-niece relationships repeated across multiple branches. The coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity between parents, was in some cases higher than 50%, meaning the parents were as genetically similar as identical twins. To put that in perspective, most human populations have inbreeding coefficients below 1%. Anything above 25% is considered catastrophic. The Morrows had been operating at levels that shouldn't have been biologically sustainable. And yet they had survived generation after generation, producing children with increasingly severe abnormalities, but just enough genetic viability to continue the line. Crane documented dozens of individuals across the family history with profound disabilities, deafness, blindness, skeletal deformities, severe intellectual impairment, and an infant mortality rate approaching 70%. Most of these deaths were never officially recorded. The bodies were buried on family land. The state never knew they existed. When Crane tried to publish his findings in 1976, he was blocked. The university's ethics board raised concerns about privacy and consent. The state health department pressured him to redact identifying details. And then something stranger happened. Crane received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as representatives of a private foundation interested in genetic research. They offered to fund his work, but only if he agreed to certain conditions. The data would be anonymized completely, publication would be delayed indefinitely, and all physical samples, blood, tissue, records, would be turned over to their foundation for secure storage. Crane refused. 3 weeks later, his office was broken into. His files were stolen. His samples disappeared from the university's lab freezer. Local police investigated but found no leads. Crane, shaken and fearing for his safety, abandoned the project. He moved out of state the following year and never spoke publicly about the Morrow family again. When he died in 1991, his widow donated his remaining personal papers to an archive where they sat unexamined until 2003. That's when researchers finally pieced together what he had found and realized that someone, somewhere, had desperately wanted that information buried. Ethel Morrow lived for 22 years after giving birth to that child. She never left the family property again. Neighbors who occasionally saw her described a woman who moved like a ghost, silent, empty-eyed, present but not alive in any meaningful sense. She never married, though marriage in her family wouldn't have meant what it means to most people. In the 1940 census, she's listed as living in the household. Occupation, blank. Relationship to head of household marked only as kin. That's all. Just kin. A woman erased into a single word. When she died in 1954, her death certificate listed the cause as congestive heart failure, but the attending physician, not Dr. Haskell, who had long since retired, noted probable long-standing rheumatic damage. There was no autopsy. She was buried in the family plot somewhere in those Kentucky hills in an unmarked grave, alongside the generations that came before her and the damaged children who came after. The Morrow family line essentially ended in the 1970s. The last known member, a man named Silas Morrow, died in 1981 in a state care facility. He had been removed from the family property in 1976 after a social worker discovered him living alone in conditions described as uninhabitable. He was 43 years old but had the cognitive capacity of a young child. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. He spoke fewer than 100 words. When asked about his family, he would become agitated and rock back and forth, repeating the phrase, "All gone now. All gone now," until he exhausted himself. The property was eventually seized for unpaid taxes and sold at auction. The new owners tore down the old cabin and built a modest home. They lasted less than 2 years before selling and moving away. They never said why, but local rumors suggested they found things on the land. Bone fragments. Rusted metal that might have been restraints. A stone structure built into the hillside with a door that had been sealed from the outside. We'll never know the full truth of what happened to Ethel Morrow during that missing year. We'll never know how many other women in that family suffered the same fate, their stories never even whispered beyond the hollow. What we do know is this. The case exists. The medical records exist. The genetic studies exist. And they tell us something profoundly disturbing about what can happen when isolation, ignorance, and ideology combine in the darkest possible way. This wasn't ancient history. This was 20th century America. These events occurred within living memory in a country that prides itself on progress and civilization, and it was hidden deliberately and systematically by institutions that decided some truths were too ugly to expose. There's a small historical marker now about 15 miles from where the Morrow property once stood. It commemorates the pioneer families of eastern Kentucky. It mentions nothing about genetic collapse, about women held captive, about children born to suffer and die in silence. History, we're told, is written by the victors, but sometimes it's written by those who simply choose to look away. Ethel Morrow had no victory. She had no voice. She had only a brief moment of documentation, a photograph, a medical report, an autopsy of her child, before she was swallowed back into silence. We remember her now not because the system wanted us to, but because a few people refused to let her story die completely. And that photograph from 1932, the one with her hollow eyes staring into the camera, still exists in that university archive. You can request to see it if you know where to look. But be warned, once you see her face, you'll understand something that can't be unlearned. Some people aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by the truth. And Ethel Morrow's truth is that she was sacrificed on the altar of her family's delusion, buried alive in more ways than one, and forgotten by a world that decided her suffering was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Until now.